So here we are. Oops, I'm trying to make that bigger. There we go. That looks pretty cool. History 300. Thought bubble number 9. This is week 10, of course. And, I'm keen to help you join the dots, as they say. It's kind of thematic for me. So we're back to Johan Rösen again. And his chapter that you've been invited to read for this week from his great book, Evidence and Meaning. It's a terrific chapter, and I'm going to go through aspects of it quite carefully. The last 3 slides will come from the other reading from Francesca Rosberg, who's looking at how to engage with thinking about inquiry, scientific inquiry particularly, before there was a division in the scientific worldview between us here in culture and nature out there, in which nature becomes the object of our inquiry. So we'll end with reflections on her wonderful, thought-provoking chapter. But yeah, let's start off by looking at Johan Rösen and what he's got to say. The chapter, of course, is about historical methodology. So he makes this point, and it's a really important one, that historical methods are basically the rule that determine historical thinking. Well, couldn't say it better myself as a research process. Okay, regulated research allows historical knowledge to be substantiated. In other words, we can test it. You can go and do some research. I'll have a look at it and I'll go, yeah, you've actually found something new there. I can see the pathway you took. I can see the checks and balances at work. So I can substantiate it. Then we'll pass it on to Tony. He'll have a read of it. And you'll go, yes, but, you could have actually done this. And, and this is the nature, at least one of the dimensions of scholarship. And, of course, it was one of the things that David Irving was criticized for in his work on the Holocaust and the Nazi experience more generally, that he didn't cross-reference, he didn't open up to critical review until he went to the publisher type thing. And also he didn't have any time for people who questioned his own, his lack of method, actually. So the existence of these rules, Rösen concludes, is not up for discussion. It is what makes history history. Without it, it will be fiction or maybe journalism of a loose sort, but it certainly wouldn't be history. So the historical methods, plural, note that, are basically the rule that determine historical thinking. So if you're a biblical scholar, you might go and use the methods that were offered to us in week 8. Yeah, from on how to, I'm trying to think of the guy's name, on Bart Ehrman. Okay, so how to actually read the New Testament as an historical document, not as a theological document or a document of faith. We've got to make sure that we become very sensitive to what kind of reading we're engaging in. Are we reading something in terms of my faith, our faith tradition? Doesn't matter whether you're a flat earther or a very committed materialist. You have to understand that your positionality plays into how you read and interpret. And it's up to us to understand that each way of reading, even the most, the most disreputable forms of reading, let's say the David Irving type of reading, is once you accept certain basic premises, becomes rational. I don't believe that conspiracy theorists think that they're irrational. It's just that if you're outside the conspiracy, you can look at it and say, hang on a second, that assumption about reality is somewhat dubious. So this is one of the things that I think Rösen is pointing to, but let's keep exploring how he unpacks this, okay? So one of the things he does, he points to the traditions that feed into the kind of thinking. Now, he's very German, okay? So he's pointing to the Germans who very much played a formative role in historical thinking. and the historiography of historical practice, I guess, the philosophy of how we do things and how we create valid historical knowledge. And he says, look, we've got these different traditions here. You know, there's the tradition Vestahan, which is, I've got it over there in the box, right? A special kind of understanding. It's an understanding that requires, if you look at the little YouTube clip that I've got there, as part of the module, you'll see that it's a way of understanding that requires emotional intelligence, our ability to empathically step into somebody else's shoes through the evidence that they've left behind, whether it's a diary of Anne Frank, or whether it's a piece of ceramics which might have a thumbprint in it from, the times of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, or wherever. It doesn't matter. That sort of understanding that there's a human presence there that we can gain some level of insight into, perhaps empathy for, perhaps even fully inhabit. This is what Wilhelm Dilthey, who's cited here, for instance, argued. And, there's that longing, I think, amongst historians to really inhabit other spaces, to understand other worlds, not just the one that we not, I'd say, forced to live in, but the one that we're very fortunate. We're living in one of the best worlds possible. We're traveling first class in this particular ship of planet Earth. There are a lot of people down in third class, but we don't talk about them very much. But he wants to make this understanding here that there's this kind of understanding, which is the humanities, particularly history, as opposed to Erklären, which is a German word that pertains to the natural sciences, that we can understand photosynthesis, okay? Ideographic thinking, that's thinking with ideas, metaphors, symbols, is different from nomothetic, which is the rational. It's a great word, isn't it? I wouldn't advise you to use it at the dinner table. Everybody will stop talking to you. But it's about, scientific method, the due process, following causal links and so on in an explanatory way. So again, it's the natural sciences. Individualizing, so we understand that an individual as a historian is unique, whereas the sciences are looking for general law. So there's a generalizing process. So you probably read that and thought, I don't understand the word this guy's saying. And you may not have gone any further because you felt either inadequate or outraged, or a mixture of both. What I'm here to do is to gloss that and say, look, it's okay. He doesn't actually spend much time on these categories, but this is the history of ideas at work here, okay? So we have traditions of thinking in which for 2 centuries, at least, thinkers like Wilhelm Dilthey, who died in 1911 or something like that, he was at pains to differentiate the way historians created knowledge and the way scientists created knowledge, and they're not the same at all. So, moving on from there, can you prove it? In other words, is something that historians, you could challenge us on. Can I prove that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon? Well, no, at one level I can't, but yes, at another level I can. Not only because Caesar wrote about it, but because many other people, contemporaries, wrote about it. There were eyewitnesses and so on. Rosen asked this question. We are now faced with the radical question of whether historical thinking can be considered scientific, in brackets, or scholarly. Now, his brackets, not mine, in the first place. So, I summarize the next bit by saying historical thinking has to be accessible and relevant, but also objective. There is a need for some distance. You can't, if you're totally on the inside of some historical event, you can't necessarily do it justice. You can't identify causal chains where the new bursts in and there's a rupture in the causal chain system and so on. The formation of historical meaning, Rosen concludes, therefore, is fundamentally connect scholarly knowledge to the reality of daily life. Now, Rosen's very German in this. He talks a number of times about daily life and so on. In fact, one of my other quotes further down has that. But look, there's this book here, a German book translated reconstructing historical experiences and ways of life, the history of everyday life. This is a particular tradition in historiography that Röhrsen is not only acknowledging, but I think he inhabits that space, okay? And it's about how we relate to evidence, okay? What is historical evidence? What constitutes historical evidence? That's why I've been talking about text, orality. We've been talking about the interdisciplinary nature of history today and so on. It's really important to understand that the historian draws on a wide variety of texts in order to create meaning, to interpret, and or to use the term that he used, to understand, but a historical understanding, okay, that we're after here. So the historical method forces historians to be rigorous, and that there's a validity and falsifiability at work here. Okay, scholarship is method. I really like that. He starts really coming up with the goods here. He says, look, to be a scholar is a person who validates, appreciates the struggle to find meaning, or inverted commas, truth, or even, I don't like the word, but Röhrsen uses it quite a lot at one point in this reading, answers to questions, all right? Given that answers are, I think, contextual, we have to understand, therefore, that an answer for you might not be an answer for me, and so on. Why? Because of age, gender, perhaps philosophical orientation, perhaps you have a different faith tradition to me, or whatever it is. Method subjects thinking to rules. I think that's really nice, that allow academic study consistently to produce new knowledge, new ways of understanding. Knowledge here and understanding need to be understood as linking together, as fused together. The methodological character provides scholarly knowledge with one more feature. It's intersubjective justifiability. What does that mean, intersubjective justifiability? Well, it means that I can give my paper of research to you and Tony and so on, and Amy, and you can all go and read it, and you can see how I arrived at my conclusions. And if you follow the same path, you will arrive at very similar conclusions. One of the interesting things about scholarship in the humanities, in more broadly speaking, is that this goes on all the time. I've got different books around me, okay? Each one follows a particular logic, a particular methodological approach that I can follow. I might disagree with tangents that appear here and there on this, in this continuity, or I might feel, yeah, I can actually understand that, I can appreciate that, but at the same time, I think they're missing something, and you add to it. It's a conversation, it's a dialogue, and that dialogue is why the colloquium method in our course is so important, to sit around after everybody's done their presentations. Hopefully people, at least some of the people in the room, have done the readings, and we can talk about the thinking. This is something that we don't allow time for in our busy life, but it's so important. So intersubjective just means you and me sitting around talking about it at an informal level, but it also means that I publish my paper in some great journal and 100 other scholars read it, and 80 like it and 20 dislike it, and the 20 who dislike it critique it, and the 80 who like it cite me in their papers, okay? And this is the way that the community evolves. To me, I'm not after agreement. In fact, the last thing we want is everybody to agree to the same thing all the time. I mean, that's just zombie following a zombie type thing. It doesn't, it's basically you're in your own communication bubble or whatever it is, and you end up being delusional ultimately. That's not what we want. We want feisty, vigorous, challenging conversations. The sort of stuff at a creative level that Ethan Kleinberg and Joan Scott and so on, with their theses on historian theory. You know, that's a really feisty piece of work. They're deliberately being theatrical. They're deliberately being provocative. They're putting down clear ideas, statements about this is the way they think a more robust history will be performed, particularly in the United States, where history has become very much a narrative style. Nothing wrong with the narrative, but when it's disconnected from the theoretical bases, when the theory or the thinking of the historian is not made explicit early on, usually, then we're just left with a great story about General Custer or, whatever it might be, okay? So then he talks about objectivity. It's something that this course has been talking about all along, and you guys are all over this. But I really like what he says here about historical objectivity. But he says, look, before we start on objectivity, we're not speaking about something that all human beings have in common. Why? Because that's the nomothetic, that's the general, that's the everybody summed up into one lump. And it's not that what distinguishes human beings, but rather what distinguishes human beings in their concrete ways of life. It's this again, this way of the everyday life stuff, okay? And which relates to temporal dynamics. In other words, Martin Luther, Joan of Arc, take those two, from various points in the medieval world or the early Reformation, they lived in such different temporal contexts to us, temporal, cultural, ideological, and so on. Everything happening for them and the way they experienced and the way they drew meaning out of that world is foreign to us. We might go and read the letters of Martin Luther to enter into that world, and here I'm sort of, I mean, that's the hermeneutic, to try and enter into his world, to see the world as he saw it, to understood what were the issues at work for him. We might be able to do that, but we have to become very sensitive. And this is where Tom Griffiths is marvelous with that very opening reading for the course, where, Tom Griffiths says that we need to go in there and see the world with wonder. I mean, this world of Martin Luther is totally different to the world that we inhabit. Okay, and that way, historical knowledge can form distinct identities. In other words, the identities that emerge, that rise out of the mists of the past for us. But he goes on to say, and he has the italics in the reading. It's not me put them there. But historical objectivity is something different. It is a certain way of realizing that this particular and especially distinctive subjectivity and taking it seriously rather than ignoring it altogether. So it's to do with the ability to understand this particular subjectivity. I don't think it's referring to, Martin Luther or somebody from the past. It's a kind of subjectivity that you and I cultivate as a discipline of history, or as the discipline in the humanities more broadly. How do you reach across time to feel the concerns, the pains, the hopes, and so on? The real fear that Martin Luther experienced when he was called by the emperor to come and justify his position, because he could have died, and not just sort of falling, by having his head cut off, burnt at the stake, tortured, and so on. It took a certain kind of bravery, guts to do that, to reach across time and to understand why he would still go ahead and do that when he knew how dangerous it was, especially when you consider that, what was his name, John Huss, had been invited by an earlier emperor about a century before Luther and promised safety. And when he got to the court, he was thrown into prison and tortured and executed and burnt at the stake. So, for Luther, who knew this, to go on the promise of this emperor, of another emperor, to the court and stand up and say, this is what I believe, the mythical "here I stand," which you may or may not know of, but it's a line that's attributed to Martin Luther, though probably historically inaccurate. Oh, sorry to pop your bubble. But this is what we're after here, is a kind of historical subjectivity, the ability. Collingwood, another great early historian, or early 20th century historian, he called it the historical imagination. Okay, and that kind of ability to reach across empathically is what the subjectivity is that Rosen is referring to here. So, what can we say about method? Well, the method needs to suit the nature of the research. So Bart Ehrman's method for looking at the New Testament is not necessarily the best method for looking at something else. So we've got to remember that. So it's unique, but it is rigorous. We've got to be able to see that this method holds true for the task at hand. So these features, this is quoting Rosen, and then I put in bold the concepts, hermeneutics, non-aesthetic, and so on. The reference to evidence, that means we can't deviate from the material in front of us, from the evidence that we have. The argumentative character, and he spends a lot of time on arguments because the way we argue, the way we deploy logic is really important in joining the dots, is probably what is a good way of putting it, and the methodological research itself. Okay, these give historical knowledge that is produced through scholarly historical research, a distinctively scholarly character. I think that's really important. Okay, and so again, he's just reaffirming, and this is all from the first half of his chapter. So to sum up, he says, look, methods means path. He gives the etymological root of the word method. It means a path to a determined goal. In other words, understanding. And he cites heuristics, and I've got a link there so you can go and read more about it. But heuristics is a certain kind of understanding. And the term is also contextual. In other words, biblical heuristics is a very specific kind of study, as opposed to a more general heuristics, you could say. So one is a subset of the other. This is where adjectives become very useful. Biblical heuristics, for instance. We've got criticism, that's the tension, that's the intersubjective, and the interpretation. That's the argumentative, the actual ability of the historian to distill all that evidence and come up with a meaningful, compelling case for whatever it is that they're writing about. So one of the things he talks about, and the next quote is particularly brilliant in this, is that we've got to search for the material in which the past is present. So the past might be present in terms of looking around my room here. Let's grab Thoth here, the Egyptian god of writing and knowledge and so on. So with the ibis head, just in case you don't know. So the past is not present in this because it comes from that period. The past is present in this because it's a reference to that period. But we've got to understand that we've got to get some distance with that past. And we've got to do what Tom Griffith says, but this is not quoting Griffith, it's quoting Rosen. We've got to deploy the attitude of not yet knowing. We might have a hunch. I can see somebody going into an archive with a sense that such and such happened, or that there's more to this question, and you follow your hunch. There's an intuition there at work. And of course, scientists can have intuition as well as humanists or people working in the humanities can, or scholars. But that not knowing yet, you can't force the material to fit your hunch. You've got to actually follow the material, and that's where Elton comes in really handy. So let's look at this wonderful next paragraph. So, but this presence of the past, okay, so we're still following Thoth here, is precisely not the empirical evidence that we direct historical questions to. Empirical evidence is the reification of the past. In other words, it's saying, look, we've got this evidence here, and this is David Irving's key fault. He reified the past. Well, it's one of his faults, actually. It's not the only key fault, because he actually cherry-picked his material to fit the argument, okay, that he was making, the case that he was making, that, Hitler was actually a nice guy. Empirical evidence is the reification. That means turning it into something that is almost materially concrete and can't be questioned or changed. To put it more drastically, and this is the part I really like, the past that lives within the condition of the present, Tolthea, must be methodologically killed to become visible as the past. And this is the objectification part. When we become objective, we are forcing a distance, a gap between myself. I might emotionally relate to the diary of Anne Frank, but at some point I've got to put that diary into the context of 1941, 42, 43, whenever it was written. I'm not sure on the dates. You know, I've been to Amsterdam, so I've seen where Anne Frank lived those years up in the attic. Okay, that house is there, and it's almost like a temple, a place where people go. You know, there are queues, really long queues to get in, and so on. So we've got to separate that, and we've got to look at the context of the Jewish girl's life, any Jewish girl's life at first. We've got to look at the kind of education she had. Then we've got to look at other evidence about her so that we can sort of work out where she was subjectively in her own self. There's many things that we need to do that somehow take them. Some people would say we're taking the magic out of the diary of Anne Frank. Okay, the same could be said when we start dissecting the Bible using, or the New Testament, and looking at what did Jesus say and what didn't he say. You know, we're taking the magic out. But no, I think we have to understand that these documents perform different functions. But for me as an historian, I have to go in and I have to put my faith, my assumptions, my feelings to one side. We have to methodologically kill that, put it over there, so that then I can perform my task of looking at the evidence that comes to hand and come to a conclusion about that. Knowing, of course, that the conclusion might change as new evidence emerges and so on. So only then, Rosen concludes, are we able to perceive the temporal difference between past and present and recognize the particularity of the past. Okay, the time in which Anne Frank lived, the terror of, occupation in the Netherlands and so on. In the heuristic sense, okay, the sense of understanding, the past becomes the object. The objective facts become empirical evidence, so they're not reified, which is what he's talking about earlier. Hopefully you're following me, of human lives from the past. The past only becomes a subject for research in this objectified form. In other words, we are performing a very complex dance, you could call it. I tend to think in terms of dance around, let's say, the Diary of Anne Frank. I'll stay with that, okay? We need to understand that, the age, the gender, the political climate, the role that fear and suspicion all played. We need to know that, Anne Frank, and much of her family died, after they were betrayed and captured by the Nazis and shipped off. We need to know many things about this, but we also need to know how her experience was unique within the system of, an oppressive system of genocide. But we also need to know that the genocidal sort of tendencies are still alive and well in our own world, and so on. It goes on and on. But it's what makes history such a subtle science. And that's what Rosen's really trying to make plain. Now I want to jump from there to Francesca Rochberg's work, just for the last 3 slides. Okay, so what we now got is, I guess, an example of some of what Rosen's been talking about. She outlines the question of how to reimagine frameworks for phenomena that do not involve all-encompassing nature. Her question really is, how do we, living in a world where the division between nature and culture has been, so clearly enforced in all our knowledge systems for 2,500 years, how do we enter the world, pre-Greek world, of cuneiform scholars and make sense of that world without belittling it, without diminishing it. Her basic point is that you've got work like this cuneiform tablet here that was being done over 2,000 years. Human beings observing the world. It's not the natural world, but it's the world. Developing knowledge. The Assyrian scribes knew about the hypotenuse, the Pythagorean Theorem, as we call it today, even though we know historically that it's much older than Pythagoras. He may have introduced it perhaps to the Greek world. That's possible, but it's still unlikely. It is this question of how to reimagine, she says, a framework for phenomena that does not involve all-encompassing nature. How do we even start to think about something so alien to us? And how methods of knowing can function within such a framework through the use of empirical, deductive, associative, and analogical reasoning. She gives us a shopping list, just like Rursson does. This is, how do we do this empirically? How do we read and deduce and move from the deductively from one position to the next? How do we do an associative and analogical? They're similar. The associative is comparing other texts of the cuneiform period, and the analogical. How do we work with the similes and associations, analogies, even metaphors that people at this time, 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, it's a long time in terms of textual history. How do we do that? And that's what her writing is all about. Science and its object, nature. There are many ways, she says, to define science: by its process and its methods, which is, of course, what Rursson was talking about, especially in those first pages of the other reading; its practice and its principle and most generic product, which we would call knowledge. The product of any form of scientific investigation is knowledge. Understanding is what probably the historical equivalent would be. So again, we can sort of work analogically between the two. Yet, from our point of view, the multiple ways we can define science seem to involve the conception of nature. We would be inclined to say that the principal product of science was knowledge of nature. If that is so, what was happening before we had the division between culture and nature? Were those cuneiform scribes and scholars actually scientists of some kind? They followed, and she makes it quite clear, they followed deductive reasoning. Their assumptions about the world were different, though. Nature wasn't out there. It wasn't that green stuff. It wasn't the movement of celestial bodies. It wasn't my digestion system. They knew about these things, but they didn't see them as nature. So they weren't objectifying certain things that our culture has come so happily and unconsciously to accept as, I've got a headache, I'll go to the doctor. If you had a headache in the Assyrian or the Sumerian period, it was probably some evil spirit doing something to you. They got to the conclusion a different way. So, and this is the last of the my investigations with Rochberg on the cuneiform. But she says, look, although we can try to define a conception or conceptions of knowledge in the ancient Near East, no equivalent classification in cuneiform languages serves to unify particular forms of knowledge, reasoning, social practice in quite the same way as does our classifier, in other words, our category, scientific. We would not call using, modern or contemporary definitions, we would not call what the ancients of the Near East were doing as scientific. But why not? They were rigorous, they followed logic, they had a 2,000-year tradition of thinking. They read one another's work. They had libraries, like the library that was it this course? I can't remember now. That I referred to. That what was his name? Not Nebuchadnezzar. one of the other Assyrian kings had the famous library that burnt down, and that's one of the reasons why we've got so many cuneiform tablets, is because all those tablets in the library, they weren't paper or papyrus, they were clay, so they all got fired, and we've managed to dig up, hundreds, if not thousands of them. So she gives us a hypothesis. She says her hypothesis is that the cuneiform world remained unshaded by categories, in other words, undistorted, emerging from and dependent upon the conception of nature. One such category is, a shadowy category is supernatural. We can project that term onto the cuneiform writers, but they would not have seen it as supernatural. Another is the kind of the notion of natural kind itself. In the absence, she concludes, of such categories that stem from the idea of nature so firmly implanted in our own understanding of things, what serves as to structure the various bodies of cuneiform knowledge. So that's the entire book. Action to he's looking at sense of cuneiform knowledge. How do we understand it as science in the absence of nature? That's why the book itself is called Before Nature. She's providing us with a set of tools to think through, as she's thought through this material, so we can follow her thinking. Historical method is a path, remember, a path to understanding or knowledge. It's a path that has a specific goal. We want to if you want to understand the cuneiform world of the pre-Greeks, then you need to develop certain tools or apply certain tools to those texts, okay? To try and heuristically, and I think that word is very, very important, to enter the shoes of at some level of people writing those texts. How do we think about a world where culture and nature are not separate? This is a really relevant question. It's not just some arcane sort of task that we set ourselves. It's relevant. Why? Because right now, with climate change, nature is banging on the door, the world out there that we've separated, that we've objectified, we've turned it into, what do we call it? Resources of different kinds. We need to control floods by creating dams or building dikes. We need to keep on accessing energy by building nuclear power plants or, keeping on mining coal. It's because we see nature as out there as an objectifiable thing that we are in our current predicament culturally, civilizationally. This is where she's going. So to conclude then, there are a bunch of conclusions here in these little green boxes. Historical method is not scientific, but it is rigorous. Scientific as in the natural sciences. Historical method can be described even though it is flexible. Rosen is showing how there are various elements at work in describing any form of historical thinking. Objectivity is dependent on the method, okay? If you need to, what's the great phrase? You need to kill the past in the present so you can have some distance. These categories matter, categories like nature matter, and so on. We need to a soft empiricism. That means that we need to follow empirical kinds of rules. We have evidence, but our soft empiricism is interpretive. We need to kill the past in the present. Yes, when I read that, I thought, wow, that's such a cool phrase. Scholarship is method. That's basically, I could put that in quotation marks because that's exactly the phrase that Rosen uses. Scholarship is method. Without it, we're not scholars. We're just voyeurs. We're just happy travelers reading, but not assimilating, testing, comparing, and so on. We need to cultivate. Thanks, Tom Griffith, and thank you, Herr Rosen. We need to cultivate not yet knowing. So these are the sorts of things that you need to be thinking about. And we think about them because they are important to our practice, okay? That's really the bottom line. It's important to our practice. Now, week 11's readings are, we're going to have a look at Mary Beard and the way she practices her scholarship. It's a good way. And then the weeks 12 and 13, it will be more open discussions rather than guided discussions. And we'll also, of course, be looking very closely at how you're going with your final assessment items and so on. So that's where we will go. So I want to thank you very much. I'll stop sharing and I will bid you adieu. Ciao. A bientôt.